There are only three things, genuinely just three, across every narcissistic relationship pattern we've examined throughout this entire series, that reliably produce actual emotional breakdown rather than the calculated performance of distress he's spent his whole life perfecting. Everything else, every manufactured crisis, every dramatic outburst, every apparent devastation timed suspiciously well to interrupt your own moment of clarity, is theater. These three things are different. They bypass the performance entirely and touch something genuinely, involuntarily real. Today, we're examining exactly what these three things are, why they specifically, out of everything else that might seem like it should destabilize him, actually succeed where so much else fails. The first thing, genuine, sustained irrelevance. Not anger, not rejection delivered dramatically. Simple, complete irrelevance. The discovery that his actions, his presence, his very existence in your life has stopped registering as something requiring any response from you at all. We traced this extensively in our conversation about why indifference disorients a narcissist more than hatred ever could. And it's worth returning to here because it represents the first of these three genuine breakdown triggers. Remember why this works when so much else doesn't. His entire psychological architecture depends on external material to generate a sense of significance his own internal world cannot reliably produce. Anger, even rage directed at him, still confirms this significance. It tells him he still occupies space in your internal world, still holds power to affect you. Genuine irrelevance offers no such confirmation. It reveals, undeniably, that whatever significance he once held has genuinely, completely dissolved, and this revelation touches something his defensive architecture has almost no capacity to successfully manage or reframe, precisely because there's no performance, no counter-narrative, no available response that actually addresses what irrelevance has revealed. This is why genuine breakdown, when it occurs, so often follows sustained irrelevance rather than dramatic conflict. The conflict, however intense, still provides fuel. The silence, sustained long enough and genuinely enough, provides nothing at all. The second thing, undeniable evidence that someone else sees him accurately and isn't afraid of what they see. We examined this extensively in our conversation about betraying a super empath, and it's worth returning to as the second genuine breakdown trigger. Remember the mechanism. His entire narrative management strategy depends on successfully controlling what people believe about him, positioning himself favorably regardless of what actually occurred. This strategy typically works because it depends on the other person's uncertainty, their willingness to eventually accept his version, their fear of confrontation, or their own self-doubt providing him room to maneuver. When he encounters someone whose accurate perception cannot be successfully argued against, reframed, or dismissed, someone who sees him completely and simply isn't destabilized by what she sees, something genuinely breaks in the narrative control he depends on for stability. This isn't about public exposure or dramatic confrontation. It's about the quiet, permanent knowledge that somewhere, someone knows exactly who he is and continues existing, unafraid and unbothered, in that knowledge. The third thing, the collapse of his predictive model. We trace this throughout our conversation about how a narcissist knows he's lost you forever. This is the genuine crisis of competence that occurs when his fundamental understanding of how relationships work, how his tactics reliably produce outcomes, proves definitively, undeniably wrong. This isn't simply about you specifically. It's about his confidence in his own ability to navigate the world successfully, a confidence his entire sense of self depends on maintaining. Together, these three things, genuine irrelevance, undeniable accurate perception without fear, and the collapse of predictive competence, share something crucial in common, something worth understanding before we continue into what actually happens once any of them takes hold. Let's examine what these three things actually share in common, because this shared quality reveals something important about why almost everything else, every manufactured crisis, every dramatic confrontation, every attempt to provoke a reaction through more conventional means fails to produce genuine breakdown, while these three specifically succeed. Each of these three triggers removes something external for him to work with. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic defensive architecture functions. It requires material to process, deflect, or reframe. Anger gives him material, something to defend against, escalate with, or eventually win through persistence. Accusation gives him material, a narrative to counter, evidence to dispute, a story he can rewrite in his own favor. Even sadness, if it's visible and directed at him, gives him material, confirmation of his continued significance, something to manage through performed comfort or manufactured guilt. Genuine irrelevance, undeniable accurate perception, and predictive collapse offer nothing of this kind. There's no external material to process, because what each of these three things actually confronts him with is entirely internal: the absence of his own significance, the permanence of being truly seen without power to alter that seeing, the failure of his own fundamental competence at navigating relationships. This is precisely why genuine breakdown, when it occurs, so rarely looks dramatic in the moment it's actually triggered. It looks like nothing at all, externally, because what's actually happening is entirely internal, a private confrontation with something his psychology has spent an entire lifetime successfully avoiding. Here's what's crucial to understand about why this distinction matters so much, beyond simply satisfying curiosity about narcissistic psychology. If you've spent any time throughout this relationship trying to produce genuine breakdown through more conventional means, through the perfect argument, the perfect evidence, the perfect emotional appeal, understanding these three actual triggers explains why those attempts consistently failed and why they were always going to fail, regardless of how skillfully or how justly you deployed them. You weren't failing at confrontation. You were using tools that by their very nature could never access the specific vulnerability these three things uniquely reach. Let's examine what actually happens once one of these three triggers takes hold, because the resulting breakdown, when it's genuine, follows a distinct pattern worth understanding in detail, both for recognizing it accurately if you witness it, and for understanding why it rarely, despite its genuine intensity, produces the transformation you might hope it eventually would. The first observable sign, once genuine breakdown begins, is often what we might call behavioral incongruence. Actions that don't match his usual patterns, decisions that seem uncharacteristically impulsive or self-destructive, a general quality of someone operating outside his normal, carefully maintained equilibrium. This might manifest as sudden career instability, unusual social withdrawal, or conversely, uncharacteristic recklessness in areas of life that previously seemed stable and controlled. This incongruence reflects something we discussed extensively in our conversation about narcissistic breakdown following permanent loss: the simultaneous collapse of multiple supporting structures, regulatory outsourcing, narrative infrastructure, predictive competence, that previously operated together to maintain his functional stability. The second observable sign, often emerging alongside or shortly after the first, involves a specific quality of desperation in how he engages with anyone still willing to provide the validation he's lost access to. This might look like intensified investment in new relationships, sometimes moving with unusual speed into connections that provide temporary stabilization. It might look like increased dependence on professional achievement or public recognition, an almost frantic pursuit of external validation from any available source, precisely because the specific source that previously provided this validation most reliably has become permanently unavailable. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why this desperation, however genuine, rarely translates into the kind of reflection that would actually address the underlying breakdown rather than simply managing its symptoms. Remember what we've established throughout this entire series about the structural nature of narcissistic psychology's incapacity for sustained self-reflection. Genuine breakdown, even breakdown this significant, doesn't automatically produce the kind of honest self-examination that would allow him to understand what actually happened and why. Instead, it typically produces increasingly elaborate strategies for avoiding exactly this examination, redirecting the crisis into external pursuits, new relationships, new achievements, new sources of validation, rather than into the internal work that might actually resolve what's genuinely broken. This is where something important needs to be addressed directly, because it connects to a specific hope that often accompanies witnessing or hearing about this kind of genuine breakdown. Does this level of authentic distress mean genuine change might finally be possible? Might finally be underway? The honest answer requires holding something we've traced throughout multiple previous conversations in this series without softening it into false hope. Genuine breakdown creates the conditions under which genuine change becomes theoretically possible, but it doesn't guarantee that change actually occurs. The difference between someone who uses this kind of crisis as a genuine turning point toward real, sustained psychological work, and someone who simply endures the crisis until temporary stabilization arrives through whatever external source becomes available, depends on factors we've discussed extensively: professional support, genuine willingness to tolerate exactly the discomfort his defensive architecture was built to avoid, sustained effort extending well beyond any single relationship's ending. Here's what's worth understanding about the third observable sign of genuine breakdown, one that often surfaces later, sometimes considerably later, than the first two, and that reveals something important about the specific nature of what's actually being processed. This sign involves what we might call selective memory intrusion, something we examined in detail in our conversation about what actually happens in a narcissist's mind after the discard. Specific, unbidden memories that resurface at inconvenient moments, carrying emotional weight he cannot fully suppress or explain away. With genuine breakdown specifically, triggered by one of the three mechanisms we've discussed today, these intrusions often carry a particular quality distinct from ordinary nostalgia or ordinary loss. A specific, uncomfortable clarity about moments when his own behavior directly, undeniably caused the harm that eventually led to exactly the outcome he's now confronting. This clarity, when it genuinely surfaces, represents something considerably closer to authentic insight than anything his psychology typically produces. But here's what's crucial to understand about why even this clarity rarely translates into lasting transformation. Insight that arrives through involuntary intrusion rather than through deliberate, sustained self-examination tends to be fragmentary and temporary. It surfaces, produces genuine discomfort, and then typically gets managed through exactly the same defensive strategies that have protected him from sustained self-reflection throughout his entire life, filed away or reframed before it can accumulate into anything resembling genuine, integrated understanding of his own patterns and their consequences. Because here's what all of this actually needs to lead toward, and it's worth being completely honest about it, rather than leaving this conversation suspended in fascinating psychological mechanism without addressing what it genuinely means for your own life and your own healing. The first thing worth understanding clearly is something we've returned to throughout many conversations in this entire series, but that bears repeating with specific relevance to everything we've discussed today. Witnessing or learning about genuine breakdown, triggered by one of these three specific mechanisms, was never actually the validation your own healing needed to wait for. It's easy, having traced this entire process in such careful detail, to start treating his eventual breakdown as the marker that finally proves what you experienced was real, that finally justifies the years of confusion, the self-doubt, the exhausting work of finally walking away or finally achieving the genuine indifference we discussed extensively in an earlier conversation. But you already know what happened. You already carry accurate, complete understanding of what you experienced and what it cost you. built through your own direct experience rather than through his eventual reaction to losing access to you. His breakdown, whether it occurs through genuine irrelevance, undeniable accurate perception, or predictive collapse, confirms something you likely already understood long before any external evidence arrived to confirm it: that your presence, your perception, and your eventual departure genuinely mattered, genuinely touched something real underneath his carefully maintained performance. This confirmation is worth acknowledging when it arrives, but it was never actually necessary for your own peace to feel complete. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that addresses a specific trap. This kind of knowledge tends to create for people who've done extensive work understanding narcissistic psychology as thoroughly as we've traced throughout this entire series. Understanding these three mechanisms with this much precision can easily become another way of remaining oriented around him, even while genuinely believing you've moved past needing anything from him at all. If you find yourself actively monitoring for signs of one of these three breakdowns occurring, actively hoping to witness or hear about genuine irrelevance finally landing, undeniable perception finally breaking through, or predictive collapse finally producing the crisis you understand so thoroughly, you've quietly slipped back into exactly the ongoing engagement we've cautioned against throughout many previous conversations, simply dressed up in more sophisticated psychological language than the more obvious pursuit or begging we discussed in earlier scripts. Real freedom here doesn't come from successfully identifying which mechanism eventually triggers his breakdown, satisfying as that identification might feel. It comes from reaching a point where whether any of these three things ever actually occurs, and if they do occur, whether you ever learn about it at all, genuinely stops mattering to your own sense of completeness. This is worth sitting with directly because it's the same underlying principle we traced throughout our conversation about genuine detachment being the only thing that actually works. The value was never really about producing or witnessing his internal crisis. It was always about your own life becoming so genuinely, completely your own, that his internal experience, whatever shape it eventually takes, becomes simply irrelevant to your own continued flourishing. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about how to hold whatever complicated feelings arise if you do witness or learn about genuine breakdown occurring through one of these three mechanisms. Remember what we discussed extensively in our conversation about the narcissist you left being on the verge of collapse. You can hold genuine, complicated human feeling about witnessing real suffering, even suffering in someone who caused you significant harm, without that feeling obligating you to intervene, without it requiring you to reconsider boundaries you established for genuinely good reasons, and without it diminishing your own clarity about what actually happened between you. This distinction matters enormously because genuine breakdown, however much it might confirm your own accurate perception throughout the relationship, doesn't retroactively transform the relationship into something safer to re-engage with, and it doesn't obligate you to provide the stabilization his psychology is now struggling to access. His breakdown belongs entirely to his own separate journey, one that exists independently of your continued attention, your continued compassion, or your continued involvement in any form, regardless of how genuinely difficult that breakdown might be for him to navigate without you. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that circles back to something we established at the very beginning of this conversation about why only these three specific things produce genuine breakdown while everything else fails. If you're currently still inside a relationship with a narcissist or processing one that recently ended, and you find yourself tempted to deliberately deploy one of these three mechanisms specifically to produce his breakdown, engineering genuine indifference as a calculated strategy, working to prove your accurate perception specifically to watch it land, deliberately disrupting his predictive model as an act of intentional confrontation, understand why this approach ultimately undermines the very thing that makes these mechanisms effective in the first place. Remember what we traced extensively in our conversation about the sentence that reveals genuine self-trust. These mechanisms only work when they're genuinely true, rather than performed as strategy. Genuine irrelevance cannot be manufactured through willpower alone, while secretly still hoping for his eventual reaction. Undeniable, accurate perception cannot be weaponized deliberately without becoming, in that deliberateness, exactly the kind of engagement that keeps you oriented around producing an effect in him rather than genuinely, completely releasing your need for any effect at all. Predictive collapse happens as a natural consequence of your own authentic healing and authentic detachment, not as something you can strategically orchestrate on a timeline that serves your own desire for eventual vindication. This is ultimately why understanding these three things matters most, not as a strategy for producing his breakdown, but as accurate, validating information about a process that either will or won't unfold on its own, entirely independent of your active pursuit of it. If you do the genuine work we've traced throughout this entire series, the grief, the rebuilt self-trust, the alternative sources of meaning, the sustained, authentic detachment, these three mechanisms may well activate as a natural consequence of your own healing without you ever needing to strategize toward producing them at all. And if they don't activate, if he somehow manages to avoid genuine breakdown through whatever combination of new supply and continued avoidance his circumstances allow, your own healing remains exactly as complete and exactly as valid regardless. This is what it ultimately means to understand the three things that make a narcissist break down emotionally. Not a toolkit for engineering his collapse, but accurate understanding of a process that unfolds, when it unfolds at all, as the natural consequence of authentic distance rather than as something requiring your ongoing strategic effort to produce. He may eventually encounter genuine irrelevance, genuine undeniable perception, genuine collapse of everything he once relied on to navigate the world. Or he may not, protected by circumstances or by his own considerable skill at avoidance from ever fully confronting what we've traced throughout this entire conversation. Either way, your own peace was never actually waiting on the answer.